In this step, we're going to assemble the right-hand part of the rear chassis to the previously assembled central chassis, install the bell cranks, and then after that we'll put the clutch block in on top of the clutch. These are the parts you need to build the right frame assembly. A little bit later I'll show you the clutch block parts. To get the right hand frame ready, we're going to install the elevator bell crank, or the elevator control assembly. Goes through the bearing. It simply pushes through with the square side facing out on the right hand frame. You're going to install these two frame spacers in these positions. You're going to install the canopy support in this position. You're using 8mm bolts on these three parts. You can see those positions. If you haven't already put the tank damper in place, you can do that now. Use the same process we did earlier. On the left frame, you need to install the canopy standoff for that side. It goes in that position, 8mm bolt on the inside. Now we're ready to put that right frame on this assembly. Once the right side frame's complete, we're going to put it on the chassis that we put together earlier. It's going to slip over the fuel tank. You have to start it on the front end, push it down. Make sure you take this elevator bell crank and slip it into the bearing on the left side frame, like so. We're ready to put the bolts in. You're also going to need the side frame brace as on the left hand side. It'll go in the same position. This right side frame is going to be installed just like the one on the other side. I'm going to use 8mm bolts in all the positions except this one, which is a 12mm, and these two, which go through this frame side brace, which are 10mm. You go ahead and tighten these down. Don't over tighten them, because we're going to line the frame up, the whole assembly up, after we're done with this. Once you've got the bolts in place on the right side frame, flip the model over, go to the left side. There's two 8mm bolts that need to go in that connect the two frame spacers that went in with this step, so that it's a complete unit. So now that this frame is all assembled, you'll remember that we really didn't tighten down any of the bolts in any of this assembly. Everything's lined up now. Go back and put blue thread lock and tighten down all the bolts on both sides of the frame, except for the motor. Don't tighten those. Don't bother to thread lock those or tighten them, because we're going to be removing that, or removing those bolts shortly. One thing to not miss is the bolt on the retainer here on the main shaft. What you want to do is you want to push the main shaft down and then lift this collar up with your finger and then tighten that bolt. You don't have to kill it, you just need to make sure it's tight. That ensures that the main shaft can't move up and down. Once this is all tightened, then we can install the bell cranks. The aileron and pitch bell cranks are going to be assembled the same way. Take one of the bearings, press it into one side, doesn't matter which side, flip it over, take the steel spacer, drop it in the center, take the remaining bearing, and then you're going to press it in to the other side. You may have to press pretty hard or against a flat surface, because it'll fit tight. You're going to do that with both the aileron and the pitch bell crank. We need to install the control balls on the bell cranks. They're plastic, the balls are metal, so you need to use slow CA on the threads. They're just going to thread in. Don't over tighten them, because they will strip the plastic. And I'll show you in the next setup how these are arranged on all three of the bell cranks. Here you can see the assembled bell cranks, the aileron and pitch bell crank and the elevator. The two balls go into the servo side on this side. The control side for the swash plate goes into on the opposite side. you'll make both of them the same way. The elevator bell crank, 2 balls go into the side with the raised portion on it. On the other side there's a square hole that's going to go over the aileron control, or the elevator control that we built earlier. So these are ready to install on the model. The order of assembly on the aileron and pitch bell cranks is they're going to be positioned like so, with the control ball on the inside. You're going to use the aluminum spacer, which has a little ridge on it. That ridge is going to face the bearing, slip over the 25mm bolt. Then you're going to thread it through this upper hole in the front of the rear frame, and it's going to thread into this center frame spacer. You're going to use blue thread lock. Be careful not to get it in the bearings, and you're going to do both of them the same way. Once you get the aileron and pitch bell cranks tight, this is what it'll look like. The 25mm bolts going all the way. They thread into the spacer here in the center. For mounting the elevator bell crank, you position the elevator control arm such that the swash plate followers are roughly parallel. That's going to make the squares on the shaft parallel with the frame, and this is simply going to go over here at a slight angle because again it's lining up to the servo, and you're going to put a 12mm bolt through it and tighten that down. You're going to want to use slow CA on that because it's going into plastic. Okay, at this point this is what you should have. You can see the bell cranks are in place, both the aileron and pitch. They should be positioned like so that when they're at an angle, the output will be level, because that's going to be where the rods go up to the swash plate. The elevator bell crank in the back, when the control arm is level, the bell crank will be at a slight angle because it's got to line up with the servo wheel down here. Again, the bell cranks in the front need to be in this orientation when you've got it complete. So the next thing we're going to do is put the clutch block in and the clutch bell and get that lined up. So here are the parts you need to assemble the clutch itself. One of the things I want to point out, Century is very good about offering multiple options for gear ratios. The standard kit comes with a 14-tooth pinion. They have several other options. I'm going to use a 13-tooth pinion because I like to run the engines at a higher RPM for the same head speed. So I'm going to use the 13-tooth pinion for this assembly. The kit comes with a 14-tooth standard. To put the clutch bell together, you need the bell, the pinion you've selected, and these two bearings. The large bearing slips over the clutch bell like so. Take the pinion, thread it in, use blue thread lock on this, and then the smaller bearing fits on top of the pinion like so. Now we're going to put the clutch block around this. Once you've got the bearings on the clutch, we can put the clutch block around it. It's 2 pieces of plastic. They're going to go on engaging the bearings like so. And then you use the 4 spacers and simply slide them through to engage the 2 pieces together. That's going to keep the the clutch assembly in here so it can't get out. And now we're ready to put the start shaft in. Now that the block's together, you want to push in the start shaft bearing on the top, take the start shaft, insert it through the bottom of the clutch, and then the next thing we'll do is put the coupler on it. The last thing to put on the clutch block is the start coupler. It's got 2 set screws. One of those needs to go on the flat that's on the start shaft. So make sure you line that up and tighten that down with thread lock, and then tighten the other one against the shaft. When you're done, this is a clutch block assembly. It's got the starter coupler on it, which is engaged on the start shaft in the center. This will turn freely, ready to be installed in the main chassis. So in order to put the clutch assembly or clutch block assembly into the frame, you're going to have to lower the motor. We talked about earlier not having this tight. The reason is you're going to have to lower the motor to put this part in. So take out the two side bolts and the front bolt. The motor will lower down. By the way, you can't have obviously the carburetor or even the isolator block on the motor. So if you've still got that on, you're going to have to take it off so that it can drop down far enough for this to go in. It goes in with the gear side obviously facing the main gear. Just slips between the frames like so. And you're going to line up these holes. Use 8mm bolts to hold it into place. So the clutch block is going to be held in place by 4 8mm bolts. They go into the slotted holes just above and below the main gear here, and you're only putting in the back half at this point. Now, unlike a straight cut gear, you don't really want any gap in this. Most of those you put like a piece of paper between them to keep them just a little bit of gap. You don't want to run any gap in this, so just use your fingers to push some pressure against the gear so that it's square. Try rotating the head to make sure it's flat or it's evenly aligned, at least this part of it, and then go ahead and tighten these down. You can fully tighten them with thread lock at this point because you've got the right gear ratio in. Once you have the clutch bolted in, you can slip the motor up so that the clutch goes inside the bell and the start shaft engages on the bearing like so. Your goal here is going to be to align the mount bolts in the sides and the front of the motor. You can also take a look at the clutch at this point. If when those holes align you see the clutch protruding out the bottom of the bell like this, then you're going to need to take one or both of these brass spacers that we had back when we put the motor together, spin the clutch off and put it between the clutch and the flywheel, because what you want is a very small amount protruding from the bottom of the clutch, or for it to be flush when the engine holes align. If it's too far in, it'll be dragging on the clutch. If it's too far out, it's not fully engaging the shoes. There will be some expansion of the motor when it gets hot, but you generally want the shoes to be flush with the bottom of the bell. It also helps you with sighting the alignment, which we'll deal with in the next step. At this point you can put the bolts back into the motor. Don't thread lock them or fully tighten them at this point though. Before considering this complete, we still need to tighten the motor up. It's still a little bit loose. The goal here is to make sure that the start shaft turns very freely. Normally the way I do this is to take a spin starter, just lightly tighten the bolts that hold the motor in place, set the motor so that no part of it that turns is on something hard, and then use the spin starter to just spin the motor over. It'll turn it at a fairly high RPM. It'll make sure that the top end part of the motor is aligned. And at that point you can fully tighten the 3 bolts that hold the motor in place using thread lock. That's about as good of an alignment as you're going to get. Now, one thing you can look at to make sure is look at the bottom of the clutch in comparison to the clutch bell. It should be flush with the bottom of the clutch. If it's up inside, it'll actually be dragging on the top of the bell. If it's protruding below, if by a lot, you want to use the spacers. If it's less than 1 millimeter, I wouldn't worry about it because there'll be some expansion when the motor gets hot anyway. But that'll take care of the engine alignment. At this point, here's what you've got. The central chassis done, the motor's in place, bell cranks are on, the clutch block's in place, fuel tank's in. Everything is ready to put the radio tray onto the front, or it's basically the front part of the frame, which engages here and on the lower motor frame. And then that'll complete the chassis.